Welcome to this podcast edition called Bioethics. I hope that you'll get a lot out of watching. The main goals for this podcast are to, number one, understand that bioethical situations are all around us. Number two, to identify different strategies for making good judgments where bioethical decisions may happen. And then lastly, to apply the bioethical decision-making process. First, we'll look at some relevant vocabulary for this podcast. Bioethics is the study of ethical and moral implications of new biological discoveries and advances in biomedicine, especially in the areas of drug research and genetic engineering. Values are the beliefs or standards that an individual cares about or feels is important. Morals can be defined as the individual's sense of right and wrong, or of good versus evil. A moral dilemma is a choice that must be made between an obvious right action and an tempting wrong action. Each course of action can be supported by one or more reasons as having significant consequences, such as life and death. Ethics is a group's sense of right and wrong, of good versus evil. And an ethical dilemma is the choice that must be made between two actions that both can be viewed as correct. So in this sense, an ethical dilemma is a little different than a moral dilemma, and that each course of action is supported by ethical principles, and there has to be significant consequences to that. And then lastly, a stakeholder is an individual who is affected by a decision that's made. Two kinds of stakeholders exist. First of all, there is the direct stakeholder. So in this case, if there's a new cancer treatment that's been discovered, and you yourself are the patient, and you decide to go for this treatment, even knowing that it's experimental, you would be the direct stakeholder. The people that are your friends and family that care about you and are impacted by your treatment, they would be the indirect stakeholders. So a stakeholder is essentially anyone who is impacted by a decision that's made. So you may have been exposed to various bioethical issues. In my class, we studied genetically modified organisms and genetically modified foods, but there's much more to bioethics than that. Cloning has been around for at least 50 years, and more recently and famously in 1997, Dolly the sheep was cloned from a cell from her mother's udder. So she was basically a twin, but born 6 years after her mother was. Currently there's a global human ban on cloning of humans, and most people have probably the most interest in cloning as a form of bioethics. Euthanasia is the right to die. So for example, if you have an illness and you are terminally ill, and there's no hope for cure, various people have decided that they have the option to die with dignity and to choose their own time and place of their death. Organ transplantation has been around for many years, since at least the 1950s, 1960s, and there are various issues that dictate who gets a kidney or a new liver versus those that don't. And so that can be kind of a dilemma in and of itself. And then reproductive technology would include things like IVF, which is in vitro fertilization, using the technologies of medicine to cure things like fertility, or to have a child through, say, a surrogate mother situation. You may have remembered there was the case of Nadia Suleiman several years ago, in which she had multiple eggs harvested and implanted through IVF, and as a result she had a huge number of children, and since then the media has nicknamed her Octomom, and that was a huge firestorm of debate several years ago that you may recall. So basically, making difficult choices in a biological world. There have been many different ways of determining what's right versus wrong over the course of human history. You may or may not have been exposed to some of these rules. I'll just kind of go over these really quickly with you. So the golden rule, I think, is most well known. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The silver rule, in its description, is basically the negative version of the golden rule. So that which you hate, you should not visit that on other people. The bronze rule is sort of the retaliation rule, where you do unto others as you've been done to. So it's kind of the vigilante motto. And then the iron rule is basically might makes right. Do unto others what you are big enough to do. And so that's probably what anarchism would say, without any limiting rules or authorities. If I'm big enough, then I'll take what I want from you. That's largely seen in the animal kingdom. So to kind of give us a sense of bioethics and making decisions in a difficult biological world, let's take an example of a kidney transplant scenario. So just for the sake of this lesson, let's assume that you're a member of the kidney transplant board at a local major university hospital. In this situation, you're going to be asked to make a really sticky decision. You'll have a list of candidates with their own backgrounds in terms of their medical histories, their financial history, what's their family structure, and that you would have to decide who gets the kidney that's available. Lots of losers and only one winner. So here we have our list. We have Dr. M, Ellen R, John S, Agnes M, and Carl C, and each of them presents different pros and cons in terms of their argument for receiving the new kidney. So let's take a look at each of them briefly, and I'll explain to you how through this decision-making process you can come up with as reasonable a choice as you can. So here we have Dr. M. He's a physician. He works in the inner city. He did have a mild heart attack several years ago, but he seems to be in good health now. He's neither married nor does he have children. So if we were to take his story and we were to sort of analyze it, pros and cons would follow. So he's a doctor, so by his job, he has the potential to help a lot of people. He's chosen to work in an inner city area, so you would imagine that that would be helping people that are maybe poor or can't afford healthcare. Some knocks on his argument for the kidney is he's a bit older, and he doesn't have any children to care for. So you may decide that he doesn't need the kidney because there's no one depending on him. Moving on to Ellen R. She's younger. She is 20. She was born with a kidney disease where her kidney is beginning to fail. She's an excellent student. She's already been accepted to law school, and her twin sister may have the same disease. So if we analyze her situation, we could say that, well, she's young, so she has a lot of life ahead of her. The disease was not her fault, so we can't blame her and deny her the kidney maybe for that reason. However, you don't know what the future holds, so there's no guarantee that she will make the best use of this second chance. And so given that this scarce resource, a kidney, is something that we want to make the most value from, then we need to choose the person that has the best mix of pros versus cons. Now we turn to John S. He's 12. He, like Ellen, had a kidney degeneration disease. He is one of 3 children to his parents. He has a limited growth because of this disease, so he's much smaller than other 12-year-olds. So if we analyze his situation, you might come up to this conclusion that, well, he's young, like Ellen, and disease is not his fault, but maybe his slowed growth has caused other potential problems that we just don't know yet. So again, there's lots of different things that we could factor in, pros versus cons. These are just a short list of examples. Agnes is 26. She's a young mother of 2. Her husband abandoned her, so she doesn't have the benefit of his support financially or otherwise. She's currently unemployed and on welfare, but she is very active as a volunteer. So if we factor in all of these details, you may come up with these or others or different pros and cons. So she's young, so her youth is maybe an advantage. She does have young children that depend on her, so by giving the kidney to her, those children will be better cared for. She is unemployed, and the cost of transplantation of any organs is quite high, and there's always going to be the continuing costs of the anti-rejection medications so that her body doesn't reject the kidney. So there's certainly some things to think about there. And then lastly, we have Carl C. He's 50 years old. He's a construction worker. He is overweight and he does smoke. He has a wife, but his children are no longer at home. So when we factor in his pros and cons, you might come up with something like this. So he does have a wife that depends on him. We don't know if the wife is employed herself. Yes, he is overweight and he smokes, but we can't necessarily know that those two lifestyle choices have led to his kidney problems. And some may say that that's not really a relevant factor to think about, that his lifestyle shouldn't be factored in. Others may disagree, and that's what makes these decision-making scenarios so difficult. So at the end of the day, if you are a member of this transplant board at this university hospital, who do you give the kidney to? What do you do? To whom do you give the kidney? In this case, you have one winner and four losers, and it's a sad fact of the matter that there are far more people waiting for organs like kidneys and heart than those people that are actually donors. So it's a difficult situation. So here's a brief overview of the decision-making process that I'd like for you to understand. First of all, you should be able to describe each of these steps. You should be able to put them in sequence, steps 1 through 4, and then you should be able to apply it to a given situation. So what is the context? Who are the stakeholders? What are the alternatives and trade-offs? And what is the solution? So first, the context. That's basically what facts really pertain to the situation. So as we saw in this previous example, medical condition, family structure, age, whether or not they're employed. If they're employed, do they have a really high impact job that would positively impact other people? Should they continue to live by virtue of this organ? So basically all the facts that you need to sort through. The second step is to identify the stakeholders. So again, who is the individual directly that will be benefited or harmed by this decision to be made? So in this case, who gets the kidney is going to be the direct stakeholder. In other situations, it is imagined that if human cloning were allowable, then you could create a clone of yourself, and that clone, when properly grown up, they could be basically a warehouse of organs. So if your kidney had failed, then you can go to that clone of yourself and demand the kidney, and that would be a way for you to have a perfect genetic match. But then the question becomes, does the cloned individual have rights? And are you violating their rights by demanding a kidney or any organ from them? Step 3, identify the alternatives. So here what we have to do is look at what are the different options that are available. So if you are on the kidney transplant list and you're waiting for that kidney, one thing that is commonly done is dialysis, sometimes daily, sometimes 3 times a week. It can be very exhausting, but that is a short-term solution to the problem of kidney failure. In other situations, for heart failure, for example, there have been individuals that have received mechanical hearts. There have been others who have received hearts from other animals, for example, pigs and baboons. So the question is, what does the present day medical science allow us in terms of solving the problem? And then lastly, what is your decision? You have to make a decision based on the complex mix of benefits versus harms. There's ethics involved, there's morality involved, there are typically winners and losers. So really, which direction do you go? What is your decision? So as we wrap up this podcast, I want to thank you for joining in today. You should have seen that bioethical situations like GMOs and cloning and organ transplantation can cause really sticky situations. If you have one or more good strategies for analyzing the facts, then coming up with a reasonable and fair decision is far easier. And lastly, you should know how to apply these steps to the bioethical decision-making process, or BDMP, to any scenario.